Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my July wrap-up. It is rather late, I know, but there we go, I have been quite busy. But I'm back from holiday now, and so I thought I would tell you about the books that I read in July. There were 10 of them in total. So for most of this year I have been starting my wrap-ups with my challenges and then moving on to other books, but I have decided I'm going to stop doing that and I am instead going to order my wrap-ups by general category. Partly because I am becoming less efficient at actually completing my challenges, and partly because I decided it would be neater. So let's start off with the classics that I read in the month of July. First off, for my Hardy read this month, which I buddy read with Alicia from Ex Libris and from Beyond the Pages and Yamini from The Skeptical Reader, we read A Pair of Blue Eyes. This is a Thomas Hardy novel that I didn't really know much about and that I hadn't heard much about. I did quite enjoy it. The protagonist of this book is a young woman called Elfie, and she lives with her father, and at the start of the book she falls in love with a young man. The book basically follows their lives and how that very early attachment affects their later lives and relationships. I can't really say much more about it without spoiling it, but I thought it was a very interesting book in many ways. There are quite a lot of themes in this that are explored in quite a lot of other Hardy novels as well. Some of the themes of secrecy and how that can affect people from Two on a Tower I could definitely see in this as well. The exploration of double standards between men and women and the way in which men within Victorian society sometimes viewed the importance of purity for a woman, that is explored very much in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and it is also explored in A Pair of Blue Eyes, but I think he explores them much better in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I think I would have also preferred to have known a little bit more about Elfride's character beyond her relationships with men. In the book she writes a novel, but we don't really know much about this novel, and I kind of wanted more about her as a writer to be explored. As a group, we also, all of us, struggled a bit with the ending. I think I liked the ending a bit more than the others, and I did kind of see what Hardy was trying to do and trying to say, but at the same time it felt like a slightly disappointing ending. So all in all, I did enjoy this. There are some brilliant scenes and some very, very dramatic, exciting moments, and some of the ways in which Hardy describes this kind of cliff landscape which he explores in this is just brilliant. But it wasn't my favourite Hardy, and I do feel that there were a few aspects where I could see what he was trying to do, but I've also seen where he's done it better in other books. Another classic I read this month was Kips by H.G. Wells. Kips was actually one of the books that came out of my TBR bowl for this month. Now, H.G. Wells seems to be vastly more well known for his science fiction than any of his other books, but Kips is not one of his science fiction novels. It is one of his realist novels in which he is kind of going along more in the sort of Dickens tradition. I've read some of his science fiction before. I've read The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds and a couple of short stories, and I have to say I much preferred Kips. What I have felt, especially in The War of the Worlds, was that it focused too much on the plot, and I didn't really feel like the characters were developed at all, and that is fine for what it is, but that's not what I like in a book. Kips, however, really good characterisation, interesting character developments, and a really good and interesting examination of social issues and class culture within the Victorian period. Kips was written in 1902, but is set in the 1870s, and it basically follows this young man Kips throughout his life and what happens to him. The easiest way for me to explain it is, imagine Great Expectations, but written by a socialist. I highly recommend Kips by H.G. Wells, and I'm definitely looking forward to reading more H.G. Wells in the future. Some more of his science fiction, but especially more of his non-science fiction and his realist writing. Now, the other classic I read this month was Thoughtless The Towers by Anthony Trollope, which was just glorious. My favourite book of the month, definitely, and I'm sure it will be one of my favourite books of the year. I love Anthony Trollope. He is a wonderful, wonderful Victorian writer, and I do feel sometimes a bit underrated. This is the second book in the Barchester Chronicles. I read The Warden back in October of last year, and I liked it, but it wasn't my favourite Trollope so far, and it wasn't as good as the other standalone Trollope novels which I have read, but I wanted to carry on with the series as a lot of people say that Barchester Towers is their favourite, or that The Warden is their least favourite. The Barchester Chronicles are set in a town called Barchester and basically explores the relationships between the clergy and the church politics within these towns. The Warden I enjoyed it, but some of the church politics is a little bit dry and at times a bit hard to follow, and I think it's the kind of book that you would only like if you're really into the Victorians. Barchester Towers, however, is more entertaining, more deep, more fully realised. And although there is a lot of church politics in it, it is a book that is in many ways about high church versus low church within the Victorian English society, but It's done through the characters and the characterization, and the characters that he draws are so strong, and some of the romantic plot lines and the family relationships in here are just wonderful. I loved it so much. I was sat on the tube grinning to myself at the end of it, and it was just beautiful. All in all, I thoroughly loved this, and I'm really excited to read the next one in the Bastard Chronicles. Next, onto the contemporary novels. The other novel, as well as kicks, that I pulled out of my TBR bowl this month was this, which is Murder Most Unladylike by Robin Stevens. I, in general, don't read that many mysteries. Mysteries tend to be things that I really enjoy when I read them, but I never really think to pick them up. This is a middle grade murder mystery, and it is not something I would have necessarily bought for myself. I won this book as a prize at a National Novel Writing Month event last November, and it has been sitting on my shelf since, and I've been meaning to read it. This book was actually originally written as a NaNoWriMo project, and then later on became published, and so I was quite interested in reading it from that perspective, and I thought it might be quite a fun, different read. I loved this so much. I wasn't expecting to love it quite as much as I did. It was so utterly and thoroughly enjoyable. Kate Howe, if you are watching, you must read this. You would love it so much. This book is about two girls who are about 13, and they're at a boarding school in England in the 1930s. One of the girls has been born and brought up in England, and the other girl, our narrator, is from Hong Kong, which I really liked. It was quite different, especially not something you find in novels set in the 1930s. And these two girls have formed the Detective Society, and in general they just detect things like missing ties and so on. But then our narrator Hazel finds the dead body of one of their teachers, and everything kind of goes on from there. I thoroughly enjoyed it as a mystery. It's really interestingly and entertainingly written, and the mystery was quite good. I did guess who the murderer was, but I didn't guess the motivation. I think my favourite thing was the relationship between Daisy and Hazel, the two girls. Daisy sets herself up as Sherlock Holmes, thereby making Hazel her Watson, and the way in which Daisy often puts down Hazel and the kind of tensions between them because of that are really, really interesting. I liked that it was more than just a book about a murder mystery. It also had this quite interesting relationship that did a lot to examine the kind of relationships that girls have when they're at school. So all in all, I thought this was lovely, and I think I will be reading more of this series. I do not normally continue properly through murder mystery series, but I loved this so much, and I thoroughly love the writing, so I am going to be continuing with this. The other contemporary novel I read this month was The Blue Girl by Laurie Foos. You have probably seen this on Booktube a little while ago. Jen Campbell and also Brittany from Under the Radar Books both enjoyed this quite a while ago. Now, I was looking forward to this, but I was also a bit uncertain about it because in general, I like magic realism in short stories a lot, but when I read novels that are magic realist, I don't like them as much. However, this, The Blue Girl, for me, magic realism done right. This was beautiful and so good. It's about this small town in America, and there is this girl who is blue, and three women in the town make moon pies, which they bake their secrets into to give to this girl, and then they feed the moon pies to this girl. And that is the premise, but that's not what it's about. The fact that there is a girl who is blue who is eating pies with secrets in is not really what this is about. Basically, there are 6 narrators in this book. There are 3 mothers and there are 3 daughters, and it's basically a book about the relationships between parents and children, and between husbands and wives, between friends and between siblings. The Blue Girl and the secret pies are used as a device to explore the very, very real emotional and social issues in this town, and I loved that. It's beautifully written and really moving, and just for me is magic realism done very, very effectively. Never explained too much and never put in your face too much. It just, yeah, it worked brilliantly. It was very, very good. I love this a lot. This, along with Bastard The Towers, was probably my other favourite book of the month. Now, on to the short stories. This month I read Reader, I Married Him, short stories inspired by Jane Eyre, edited by Tracy Chevalier. I have already made a whole video discussing this and comparing it with another Bronte-inspired short story collection called The Red Room, so I won't talk about this too much here. Suffice to say, I didn't love this. There were some short stories in this that I thought were brilliant, but in general I found the stories not that good and not at all related to Jane Eyre. I was in many ways quite disappointed with this, but like I say, there were a few stories that I loved. I will link down below my full video where I talk about this in a lot more depth. I've only read this with Liz from Now Voyaging though, and I really enjoyed reading a story a day with her and discussing it, especially because it was nice to have someone to share my occasional frustration with about the fact that very few of the stories actually related to Jane Eyre. But on to happier short story times, I read Ali Smith's Other Stories and Other Stories. I've changed my mind. I said I had 2 favourite books this month and that it was The Blue Girl and Bastard The Towers, but this is brilliant too. This is so good. I love Ali Smith. I've only read 2 of her books, but I think it's safe to say I love her. I loved How to Be Both. I love this more. She writes beautifully and she manages to convey characters and emotion very, very well in a way that I find incredibly effective. I love this collection. I thought there were so many brilliant, lovely, interesting stories in here. My 3 favourites were probably The Hanging Girl, The Theme is Power, and the final story, which is called A Story of Love. And I loved the final story, The Story of Love, because it's a happy story. And I genuinely can't remember the last time I read a short story which was happy. I like a bit of bleakness and grimness and dismalness, and I like the darkness of many short stories in general and that I read, but I realised when I was reading A Story of Love that I hadn't read a short story that was happy for a really long time, and it was beautiful, so beautiful. Her writing is wonderful, and I highly recommend her short stories. I think they're brilliant. I've actually gone out and bought another one of her collection of short stories and another one of her novels. So that tells you how much I am enjoying Ali Smith's writing at the moment. She is incredibly talented and I'm so excited to read more by her. I have one complaint against this book. The reason why I bought this collection of short stories rather than any of her other ones first was because it's called Other Stories and Other Stories, and I thought that was really fun because I was assuming that there was a short story called Other Stories and then it would be Other Stories and Other Stories. There isn't a short story in here called Other Stories, which sounds like a very petty thing to be annoyed about, but it annoyed me because it was so beautifully neat and clever, but there's not a story called Other Stories, even though there are at least 3 stories in here that could have been called Other Stories. So there we go, that is a tiny niggle that is bothering me and saddens me, but apart from that, this is a very, very, very brilliant book. Another short story collection I read this month was Broken Things by Padrika Tarrant. I read this after watching Olivia Pope's video on this book. I will link it down below, which she said it was her first 5-star short story collection ever. And we have quite similar taste in writing, so I thought I had to buy it. And I did thoroughly enjoy this. The writing is beautiful, elegant, well poised, very creepy, but always in a way that is sad and emotive even when it's creepy. It's not scary, it's kind of solemnly creepy. That sounds a bit weird. This short story collection has quite a lot of stories in. They're all very short, just a few pages, but they all have this kind of theme and feeling and atmosphere going throughout them, which is a theme really of broken things, and the broken things both refers to things in the stories and the people who are narrating. This book features a lot of people who are really struggling in life, who are very, very mentally ill or physically ill or old, or who are living on the streets, or who have barricaded themselves in their houses and are not letting their social workers in. It is a short story collection which is full of magic realism, but she does this very, very clever thing where she poises everything at the level where you never know whether the magic realism is magic or is the delusion of her characters, because all of her characters are in a slightly unstable mental state where you don't know if it's magic, like you don't know how real the magic realism is, and that is something I really liked. It was a really cleverly, nicely done aspect that was just very, very cleverly pulled off. My favourite 3 stories in this were Listen, Love and Gas, all of which were rather brilliant. Another fun thing, this short story collection is published by Salt. I ordered it off Salt's website and they put in a little packet of salt with your book. Isn't that fun? Anyway, the next thing I read was this. This is a literary magazine. This is issue 38 of Brittle Star. Brittle Star is possibly my favourite literary magazine, and I really love the little books they produce, partly because they are incredibly beautiful, but also because the quality of poetry and prose is very, very good, and I really like that they do both poems and short stories, because that is something that I really enjoy in a literary magazine. This is a special issue that is slightly thicker than normal because it consists of the winners and sort of people who are shortlisted for their short story and poetry competition this year. And it was interesting actually reading the competition winners from Brittle Star, because it does tell you, I think, how subjective writing is when you read things like this, because of the short stories that were the top 3 and commended, like, I liked the ones that came first, second and third. They were all good stories, but the story that I loved most in this collection was one of the commended ones, which is Bone Hard Ground by K.M. Elks, and it was absolutely beautiful, incredibly moving, it had me near to tears and was just a brilliant, brilliant story. And finally, the last thing in my July wrap up, I did read some poetry in the month of July, and that was just this little penguin black classic of Edward Lear. When I was doing my Victorians Poets video the other week, I read aloud an Edward Lear poem, and I had forgotten how much I enjoy Edward Lear, so I went to pick this up and read it and thoroughly enjoyed it. It's Victorian nonsense poetry. It's very weird and very glorious and hilarious. It's so surreal and strange, but in a way that is just beautiful. And you can tell from Edward Lear's writing that he is someone who loves language and loves rhyme and loves making words fit together in weird ways, which is something I really enjoy. Let me read you a bit of one of the poems to show you how silly it is. The New Vestments. there lived an old man in the kingdom of Tess who invented a purely original dress, and when it was perfectly made and complete, he opened the door and walked into the street. By way of a hat he'd a loaf of brown bread, in the middle of which he'd inserted his head. His shirt was made up of no end of dead mice, the warmth of whose skins was quite fluffy and nice. His drawers were rabbit skins, so were his shoes, his stocking were skins, but it is not known whose. His waistcoat and trousers were made of pork chops, his buttons were jubes and chocolate drops. His coat was all pancakes with jam for a border, and a griddle of biscuits to keep it in order. He wore over all, as a screen from bad weather, a cloak of green cabbage leaves stitched all together. Oh, it's so fun. Good old Edward Lear. So yes, those are the 10 books that I finished in July. There have been a few others that I've been reading. Of course, I read my 3 chapters of Our Mutual Friend for July. I will link down below my discussion video on those. If you don't know, I'm currently hosting a Victorian-style read-along of Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend, where we are reading a few chapters every month in a serialised fashion. Other things I have not finished. I've also been reading this book called Shakespeare and the Victorians. This is a non-fiction book about Shakespeare in the Victorian times. It's one of those books where the content is very interesting but the writing is quite dry, so I'm taking it very slowly and haven't read it for a few weeks now, so I need to pick this back up. But anyway, the other thing that I have been reading and have not yet finished is I have been listening to David Copperfield on audiobook. This is the audiobook narrated by Rich Armitage, who is a master of voices and pronounces waistcoat in the most glorious manner. I had forgotten how brilliant David Copperfield is. Up until this point, David Copperfield was the only Dickens book that I had only read once. All of the rest I have read 2 or more times, but David Copperfield I had only read once. I haven't read it since I was about 15, 16, but I'm listening to it at the moment. Do you remember my What the Dickens series where I ordered Dickens books in order from least to most favourite? I'm going to have to revise that order quite considerably once I have finished David Copperfield. I'm only about a third of the way through, but oh, I had forgotten. Betsy Trotwood, Peggotty, it's so good. More on that next month, or perhaps the month after, when I finally get to the end of the audiobook. It is 36 hours long, and a glorious 36 hours it will be. So, I think that is all I have to say. I'm sorry my July wrap-up has been so late, but there we go. Life has been rather busy. Please let me know how your July reading month was and what your favourite book of July was, if you can remember all those several weeks ago. I will be back very soon with another video, and in the meantime, happy reading.